The celestial crown casino floated in the void like a jewel carved from starlight and ambition, its crystalline spires catching the glow of 3 different suns as Vermilion Prime completed another rotation around the Nexus system's gravitational center. Inside the casino's most exclusive gaming hall, the air hummed with the quiet desperation of beings who had more wealth than wisdom and significantly more pride than sense. Lord Kethran Vex adjusted his ceremonial collar for the 15th time in as many minutes, the platinum threads woven through the fabric catching the ambient light in patterns that spoke of ancient Altarian nobility and increasingly modern financial embarrassment. His silver skin had taken on the slightly greenish tinge that marked his species' equivalent of nervous sweating, though he maintained the rigid posture that had been drilled into him since birth. "Your move, my lord," said Commodore Thane, a Rigelian whose tentacles gestured with the lazy confidence of someone who'd already counted his winnings 3 times over. The holographic game board between them pulsed with quantum possibilities, each move rippling through probability matrices that would have given lesser minds severe headaches. Kethran studied the board with the intensity of someone trying to read his own obituary in a foreign language. Quantum Nexus was supposed to be the perfect game for Altarian nobles. It required the kind of multidimensional strategic thinking that their species had supposedly evolved to excel at. Unfortunately, evolution had apparently failed to account for the possibility that desperation could make even the most sophisticated mind remarkably stupid. "Perhaps," said a voice from behind him, smooth as silk and twice as dangerous, Lord Vex would prefer to consider his position more carefully. Lady Seraphina Vex stood beside her husband's chair with the practiced grace of someone who'd spent years perfecting the art of looking supportive while feeling increasingly homicidal. Her violet eyes, a genetic rarity even among Altarians, held depths that suggested intelligence far exceeding her role as decorative spouse. The elaborate gown she wore was worth more than most starships, though at this rate, it might soon be all they had left. "I am considering perfectly well, thank you," Kethran replied without looking at her, his attention fixed on the quantum possibilities swirling before him like a 3-dimensional maze designed by someone with a grudge against geometry. Seraphina's smile could have cut diamond. "Of course you are, darling. Just as you've been considering perfectly well for the past 6 hours while systematically losing everything we own." The observation table around them held an audience of the galaxy's elite, beings whose combined wealth could probably purchase entire star systems but who preferred to spend their evenings watching other people's financial destruction for entertainment. They maintained the polite fiction of not listening while hanging on every word with the enthusiasm of scavengers at a particularly promising crash site. "Your lady speaks wisdom," Commodore Thane observed, his tentacles performing what passed for a shrug among his species. "Perhaps it would be prudent to withdraw from this evening's entertainment before the stakes become uncomfortable." Kethran's jaw tightened with the kind of rigid determination usually associated with people about to do something spectacularly ill-advised. The House of Vex does not withdraw from honorable competition. The House of Vex also doesn't usually gamble away its ancestral holdings on games of chance, Seraphina murmured, just loudly enough for her husband to hear but quietly enough to maintain the illusion of wifely deference. Before Kethran could respond with what would undoubtedly have been something both cutting and counterproductive, a new voice cut through the tension like a plasma cutter through aluminum plating. "Excuse me, but did someone mention honorable competition?" The speaker was human, which immediately marked him as either very brave or very stupid to interrupt a gathering of galactic nobility. He was of medium height and unremarkable build, with the kind of face that suggested he'd be perfectly at home selling insurance or fixing atmospheric recyclers. His clothes were clean but clearly mass-produced, and he carried himself with the easy confidence of someone who'd never learned that he was supposed to be intimidated by beings who could trace their lineages back to the formation of their respective solar systems. "And you are?" Commodore Thane inquired, his tentacles conveying polite interest mixed with the sort of condescension usually reserved for small children and inferior species. Marcus Chen, the human replied with a slight bow that managed to be respectful without being servile. "Independent trader, amateur philosopher, and occasional student of probability mathematics. I couldn't help but notice you gentlemen discussing the finer points of quantum nexus strategy." Kethran looked up from the game board for the first time in an hour, his silver features arranged in an expression of aristocratic disdain. This is a private game, human. I'm sure there are more, appropriate, entertainment venues elsewhere in the station. Oh, I'm sure there are, Marcus agreed cheerfully. But none of them are likely to feature players of your obvious caliber. It's not every day a simple trader gets to observe masters of strategy at work. The flattery was so transparent it should have been visible to orbital scanners, but Kethran's ego latched onto it like a drowning man grabbing a lifeline made of razor wire. You have some knowledge of quantum nexus? A little, Marcus said with the kind of modesty that immediately made everyone in the room suspicious. I picked it up during some long hauls through hyperspace. Amazing how much you can learn when you've got nothing but time and a holographic game system that came with the ship. Serafina studied the human with interest, noting the way he held himself and the intelligence that flickered behind his deliberately casual manner. There was something about him that didn't quite match his claims of being a simple trader, though she couldn't put her finger on what it was. Perhaps, Kethran said slowly, you would care to demonstrate this knowledge. Oh, I wouldn't want to intrude on your game with the Commodore. The game is concluded, Commodore Thane announced, his tentacles performing the equivalent of washing his hands of the entire situation. Lord Vex has proven, educational, but I believe I've learned all I care to this evening. Kethran's face flushed the deep purple that indicated Altarian rage barely held in check. The Commodore's departure wasn't just a withdrawal from the game, it was a public statement that playing against Kethran was no longer considered worth the effort. In that case, Marcus said, settling into the chair the Commodore had vacated, perhaps we could have a friendly game? Nothing too serious, just enough to make it interesting. What stakes did you have in mind? Kethran asked, his voice carrying the dangerous edge of someone whose pride had been wounded and was looking for something to bleed on. Whatever seems appropriate to you, my lord. I'm just a trader, I'll follow your lead on what constitutes proper stakes for a nobleman of your standing. The statement was perfectly crafted to appeal to Kethran's wounded vanity while simultaneously challenging him to prove his worth. Serafina recognized the manipulation but found herself curious to see how far her husband's arrogance would carry him. Very well, Kethran said, his fingers dancing over the holographic controls as he reset the game board. Shall we say, 50,000 credits to start? 50,000 it is, Marcus agreed, producing a credit chip from his jacket with the casual ease of someone for whom such sums were routine pocket change. The first few games passed quickly, with Marcus losing just enough to keep Kethran interested while winning just enough to avoid being dismissed as completely incompetent. He asked questions about Altarian strategy principles, complimented Kethran's tactical thinking, and generally behaved like the sort of respectful inferior that Kethran's ego required. You're quite good at this for an amateur, Kethran observed after winning his third consecutive game, his earlier frustration beginning to fade as his natural arrogance reasserted itself. Thank you, my lord. Though I have to say, your understanding of multidimensional probability cascades is remarkable. Is that something all Altarians learn, or is it a particular talent of yours? Kethran preened under the praise like a peacock being told his feathers were particularly magnificent. Altarian nobility are trained from birth in strategic thinking. It's one of the qualities that makes us natural leaders in galactic affairs. Fascinating, Marcus said, making a move that looked careless but wasn't. And Lady Vex, do you play as well? Serafina blinked in surprise, not because of the question but because someone had actually asked her opinion about something other than whether her gown complemented her complexion. Yes, occasionally. My wife's talents lie in more traditional areas, Kethran said dismissively. Decoration, social graces, maintaining proper household order. Strategic games require a certain, masculine approach to problem solving. Marcus's eyebrows rose slightly, and Serafina caught the brief flash of something that might have been disapproval before his expression returned to neutral interest. I see. Though I've found that different perspectives often lead to innovative solutions. Some of the best strategic minds I've encountered have been those who approached problems from unexpected angles. An interesting theory, Kethran said, clearly not finding it interesting at all. Shall we increase the stakes? This has been pleasant, but hardly challenging. Whatever you think appropriate, my lord. The stakes climbed steadily as the evening progressed, with Kethran's wins and losses balancing out in a pattern that kept him engaged without raising suspicion. Marcus proved to be an entertaining opponent, full of stories about his travels and observations about different species' approaches to strategy and risk. You know, Marcus said during a break between games, I've always been curious about Altarian marriage customs. The partnership between strategic minds must create fascinating household dynamics. Kethran's laugh had all the warmth of vacuum-frozen hydrogen. Marriage among the nobility is a matter of bloodlines and alliance, not partnership. My wife's family brought excellent genetic heritage and political connections to our union. What more could one ask? Love, perhaps? Marcus suggested mildly. Love is a luxury for those who can afford inefficiency, Kethran replied. Nobility requires more practical considerations. Serafina's hands tightened imperceptibly in her lap, but her expression remained serenely neutral. Years of practice had taught her to hide her reactions to her husband's casual dismissal of her worth as anything beyond a breeding vessel and political ornament. I suppose that's one way to look at it, Marcus said, though his tone suggested he found the perspective somewhat lacking. Though I've always thought that the best partnerships, business or personal, work because both parties bring different strengths to the table. Perhaps that works for traders, Kethran said with the kind of smile that wasn't really a smile at all. But nobility operates on different principles. We understand the importance of hierarchy, of knowing one's proper place in the natural order. The natural order, Marcus repeated thoughtfully. That's an interesting concept. I've traveled to a lot of worlds, met a lot of species, and I've found that what people call natural order usually just means the way things are because that's how they've always been done. Are you suggesting that thousands of years of Altarian tradition might be wrong? Kethran's voice carried a dangerous edge. Not wrong, Marcus said carefully. Just, perhaps not the only way to do things. But then, I'm just a trader. What would I know about such elevated matters? The self-deprecation was perfect, deflating the tension while simultaneously challenging Kethran to prove his superiority through action rather than words. It was exactly the right approach to take with someone whose ego was both fragile and enormous. Indeed, Kethran said, his good humor restored by Marcus's apparent acknowledgement of inferior status. Shall we make this final game more interesting? Say, 1,000,000 credits. Marcus paused, as if the sum gave him genuine pause. That's quite substantial for a simple trader. Too rich for your blood. The challenge was obvious, and Marcus rose to it with exactly the right amount of reluctance. I think I can manage 1,000,000. Though I have to admit, the thought of losing that much makes me nervous. Then perhaps you should consider what you have to offer beyond mere credits, Kethran said, his eyes glittering with the kind of predatory interest that marked beings who enjoyed watching others squirm. After all, the most interesting games involve stakes that matter beyond simple monetary concerns. What did you have in mind? Kethran leaned back in his chair, his gaze shifting to his wife with the casual assessment of someone evaluating a piece of valuable property. I propose a wager that would be worthy of this establishment's reputation. One final game, winner takes all. If you win, you claim not just my credits, but my wife's hand in marriage as well. The words fell into the sudden silence of the gaming hall like stones dropped into still water. Serafina's face went absolutely white, her violet eyes wide with shock and something approaching horror. Around them, the other patrons leaned forward with the eager interest of spectators who just realized they were about to witness either a spectacular triumph or a catastrophic disaster. I beg your pardon. Marcus said, his casual demeanor cracking slightly. You heard correctly. My wife, along with all rights and privileges pertaining thereto. A prize worthy of the risk, I believe. Kethran's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. Unless, of course, you find the prospect too daunting. Marcus looked at Serafina, whose expression had shifted from shock to a fury so cold it could have frozen hyperspace. My lord, I'm not sure that wagering another person is legal. Kethran interrupted. Under Altarian noble privilege laws, it's perfectly legal. Traditional, even. My ancestors have settled matters of honor through such wagers for millennia. Legal or not, it doesn't seem. What it seems is irrelevant. The question is whether you have the courage to accept such a wager, or whether human bravery is as overrated as human intelligence. The insult hung in the air like a challenge thrown down with a gauntlet. Marcus stared at Kethran for a long moment, his expression cycling through several emotions before settling on something that looked like quiet determination mixed with resignation. Very well, he said finally. I accept your wager. Though I want it clearly understood that if I win, the lady's consent in this matter will be paramount. I have no interest in unwilling partnerships. How charmingly primitive of you, Kethran said. But the terms are accepted. One game, winner takes all. As they prepared for what would be the most consequential game of Quantum Nexus in the casino's history, Serafina sat frozen in her chair, watching her husband gamble away her future with the same casual arrogance he'd shown when losing the family fortune. For the first time in years, she found herself hoping that someone, anyone, would prove that Altarian superiority wasn't quite as inevitable as her husband believed. The quantum game board hummed with potential energy, its holographic matrix casting shifting patterns of light across the faces of everyone gathered around the high-stakes table. Marcus Chen sat with the relaxed posture of someone who'd either achieved perfect zen or complete resignation to his fate, while Lord Kethran Vex radiated the kind of confident superiority that came from generations of being told he was genetically destined for greatness. The opening move is yours, human, Kethran said, gesturing magnanimously at the board. I believe tradition grants the challenged party that courtesy. Very generous of you, Marcus replied, his fingers hovering over the quantum interface. Though I have to say, I'm starting to feel a bit out of my depth here. This is considerably more complex than the practice games I'm used to. Indeed. Quantum Nexus at this level requires the ability to calculate probability cascade 17 moves in advance while simultaneously accounting for multidimensional strategic variables. It's quite demanding for those not bred to such intellectual rigor. Serafina watched the byplay with the kind of grim fascination usually reserved for observing natural disasters from what one hoped was a safe distance. Her husband's arrogance was nothing new, but she'd never seen him stake everything, including her, on his supposed intellectual superiority. Marcus made his opening move, a conservative placement that established basic territorial control without revealing any particular strategic philosophy. You know, Lord Vex, I've been curious about something. Lady Serafina mentioned earlier that she occasionally plays. What's her approach to the game? My wife's approach? Kethran barely glanced at Serafina as he made his countermove, an aggressive gambit that seized control of two key quantum nodes simultaneously. She plays defensively, as befits her nature. All caution and no vision. Adequate for casual entertainment, but hardly suitable for serious competition. Interesting, Marcus said, though he was looking at Serafina rather than the board. I've found that defensive players often see weaknesses that aggressive strategists miss. Different perspectives and all that. A pretty theory, Kethran replied dismissively. But ultimately, Quantum Nexus rewards bold action and superior strategic thinking. Qualities that are, shall we say, unevenly distributed among the species. Marcus's move was another conservative play, solidifying his position without committing to any major offensive. You know, in my travels, I've met strategic minds from dozens of different species. Carillion hive thinkers who could coordinate thousands of variables simultaneously, Rigellian probability specialists who could calculate odd 17 decimal places out, even some artificial intelligences that process strategic data faster than most organic minds could think. And your point? Just that I've learned to be wary of assumptions about who's smart and who isn't based on their species or background. Marcus glanced up from the board with a mild smile. Some of the most brilliant strategic minds I've encountered were the ones everybody underestimated. Kethran's laugh was sharp with amusement. How refreshingly egalitarian of you. Though I suspect you'll find that theoretical egalitarianism is no match for practical genetic advantages. The game progressed with Marcus continuing his apparently cautious strategy while asking seemingly innocent questions about Altarian culture, noble families, and strategic traditions. To the casual observer, it looked like a classic mismatch, the experienced aristocrat educating the bumbling amateur while systematically dismantling his position. "Tell me," Marcus said during a particularly complex exchange, "does Lady Seraphina share your interest in strategic games, or does she have other intellectual pursuits?" "My wife's interests are appropriately domestic," Kethran replied, not bothering to look away from the board. "Social coordination, aesthetic appreciation, household management. The sort of refined accomplishments suitable for a woman of her station." "Ah." Marcus made a move that looked random but wasn't. "No interest in politics, or science, or interstellar affairs. Such subjects would be inappropriate for a noble wife. Her role is to provide genetic continuity and social stability, not to concern herself with matters beyond her proper sphere." Seraphina's hands tightened in her lap, her knuckles white with the effort of maintaining her composure. She'd spent years listening to her husband dismiss her interests as inappropriate frivolity, relegating her to the role of decorative accessory in her own life. "I see," Marcus said thoughtfully. "Though I have to say, Lady Seraphina, your comments earlier about probability cascade suggested a fairly sophisticated understanding of mathematical principles." Seraphina looked up in surprise, both at being addressed directly and at having her casual observations remembered and taken seriously. Thank you. I studied xenomathematics before my marriage." "Xenomathematics?" Marcus's eyebrows rose with genuine interest. "That's fascinating. Different species' approaches to mathematical principles must create some incredible insights when you combine them." "It does," Seraphina said, her voice growing stronger as someone finally showed interest in her thoughts. "Each species tends to develop mathematical frameworks based on their cognitive strengths, so when you synthesize them, you often discover solutions that none of them would have found independently." "Enough," Kethran snapped, his attention finally diverted from the board. "This is hardly the time for academic discussion." "On the contrary," Marcus said mildly, "I find that understanding how different minds approach problems is crucial to strategic thinking. Lady Seraphina's insights into xenomathematics suggest she might see patterns that purely Altarian analysis would miss. My wife's amateur dabbling in theoretical mathematics hardly qualifies as strategic insight." Marcus made another move, and suddenly the board's quantum matrix shifted in ways that made several spectators gasp. What had looked like a defensive position was revealed as an intricate trap, with Marcus controlling key probability nodes that Kethran had somehow failed to notice. "Amateur dabbling," Marcus repeated softly. "You know, Lord Vex, I'm beginning to think you might be underestimating more than just your wife's mathematical abilities." Kethran stared at the board, his silver features cycling through confusion, realization, and growing alarm as the true scope of Marcus's position became clear. "How did you? This is impossible." "Not impossible," Marcus corrected gently. "Just unlikely, which is a very different thing in quantum mechanics." He made another move, and the probability cascade shifted further in his favor. "Lady Seraphina, what would you say is the most common mistake aggressive players make in multidimensional strategy games?" "They focus too much on immediate territorial gains and not enough on controlling the underlying probability matrix," Seraphina replied without hesitation. "They see the obvious moves but miss the quantum foundations that actually determine long-term outcomes." "Exactly." Marcus smiled at her with genuine warmth. "They get so focused on winning individual exchanges that they lose sight of the larger strategic framework." Kethran's face had gone from silver to an unpleasant shade of green as the implications of his position sank in. "You've been manipulating the quantum foundations this entire time." "Learning from them," Marcus corrected. "Every move you made gave me more information about your strategic assumptions. And those assumptions were, let's say they were very predictable." "Predictable?" "You assumed I was an inferior opponent because of my species and background, so you played aggressively without properly analyzing my actual capabilities. You dismissed your wife's insights because they didn't fit your preconceptions about appropriate feminine interests. And you wagered everything on the belief that your genetic heritage made you inherently superior to anyone who challenged you. Marcus made his final move, and the quantum matrix collapsed into a configuration that left Kethran with no viable options. The game was over, decided by a strategy so elegant and inevitable that even the watching nobles murmured their appreciation. "You have got to be kidding me," Kethran whispered, staring at the board as if looking at it hard enough might change the outcome. "I'm afraid not," Marcus said gently. "Though I have to say, you played exactly as I expected you would. Textbook Altarian nobility, all arrogance and no adaptability." The silence in the gaming hall was broken only by the quantum board's soft chime indicating the end of the match. Around them, the gallery of spectators began to murmur among themselves, their voices carrying the excited undertone of beings who just witnessed the impossible. This cannot be legitimate," Kethran said, his voice rising with desperation. "You cheated somehow. No human could." "Could what?" Marcus interrupted, his tone still mild but with an edge that suggested his patience had limits. "Could outthink an Altarian noble. Could see through your obvious strategic patterns. Could treat your wife with the basic respect of acknowledging her intelligence. You don't understand what you've won," Kethran said, his voice cracking slightly. "My wife is not some commodity to be traded. She is a noble of ancient bloodline, a person," Marcus said firmly. "She's a person who deserves better than being wagered like a piece of property by someone who's supposed to love and protect her." Serafina had gone very still during the exchange, her violet eyes moving between her husband and the human who just won her freedom from a marriage that had become a beautiful prison. For the first time in years, she felt something that might have been hope stirring in her chest. "The terms of the wager were clear," Commodore Thane interjected, his tentacles writhing with what passed for excitement among his species. "Witnessed by all present and recorded by the casino's legal systems. The human has won fairly." "This is madness," Kethran said, though his protest carried the hollow ring of someone who knew they'd lost but couldn't quite accept the reality. "You cannot simply take another being's wife through a game of chance." "I didn't take her," Marcus said quietly. "You wagered her. There's a difference, though I suspect the distinction is lost on someone who thinks of marriage as a matter of ownership rather than partnership." He stood and moved around the table to where Serafina sat, offering her his hand with the same respect he might show any equal. "Lady Serafina, I know this situation is unusual. And I want you to know that despite the legal technicalities, any decisions about your future are yours to make. I have no interest in unwilling partnerships." Serafina looked at the offered hand, then at her husband's face, which had gone from green to a mottled purple that suggested impending apoplexy. Marcus was treating her like a person with agency, something her husband hadn't done in years. You would give me a choice?" she asked softly. "Of course. What kind of person would I be if I didn't?" Marcus's smile was gentle, without any of the predatory calculation she'd grown accustomed to seeing in her husband's expressions. "Though I should mention that I could use a partner in my trading business. Someone with your background in xenomathematics would be incredibly valuable for calculating hyperspace routes and analyzing alien market patterns. My expertise would be valuable. Invaluable. I've been fumbling through probability calculations for years, getting by on instinct and luck. Having someone who actually understands the mathematical principles would be like upgrading from a broken compass to a full navigation system." Kethran watched this exchange with growing horror as he began to understand that he wasn't just losing his wife through legal technicality, he was losing her because someone had finally shown her the respect and appreciation he'd never bothered to offer. "Serafina," he said desperately, "you cannot seriously consider leaving with this traitor. You are a noble of the House of Vex. Your bloodline stretches back." "My bloodline," Serafina interrupted quietly, "has apparently failed to produce a husband who values anything about me beyond my genetic heritage and decorative function." She placed her hand in Marcus's, her decision clear in the straightening of her shoulders and the lift of her chin. "Mr. Chen, I believe I would very much like to learn about the trading business." "Excellent," Marcus said, his smile broadening. "Though I should warn you, it involves a lot of travel, irregular hours, and dealing with species that most nobles would consider beneath their notice." "It sounds perfect," Serafina replied, and for the first time in years, her smile was genuinely happy rather than diplomatically appropriate. As they walked away from the table, leaving Kethran staring at the quantum board that had cost him everything, Marcus leaned slightly toward his new partner. "Just so you know," he said quietly, "I really am just a trader. No secret agenda, no hidden fortune, no mysterious background. Just someone who believes that intelligence and worth aren't determined by bloodline or species." "Just a trader," Serafina repeated thoughtfully, "who happened to completely outmaneuver one of the galaxy's supposedly superior strategic minds using tactics he learned during hyperspace travel." "Well," Marcus said with a grin, "I may have understated my experience with strategic games. And possibly my background in xenopsychology. And there might be a few other details that didn't come up in casual conversation. Such as the fact that I used to work for the Galactic Strategic Assessment Institute before I decided that academic life was too boring and took up trading instead." Serafina stopped walking and stared at him. "You're a former strategic analyst." "Reformed strategic analyst," Marcus corrected. "Much more fun to use the training for profitable ventures than theoretical research." Behind them, they could hear Kethran beginning to understand the true scope of what he'd lost, his protests growing louder and more desperate as reality sank in. Neither of them looked back. The luxury suite aboard Marcus's trading vessel, the probability rose, was a study in comfortable functionality rather than ostentatious display. Serafina ran her fingers along the smooth surfaces of the navigation console, marveling at technology that prioritized effectiveness over status symbols. After 3 weeks of traveling with Marcus, she was still adjusting to the concept of being valued for her contributions rather than her appearance at formal dinners. "The hyperspace calculations for the Meridian run are complete," she announced, manipulating the holographic displays with growing confidence. "Using xenomathematical optimization principles, I've reduced the standard route time by 18% while maintaining safety parameters within acceptable limits." Marcus looked up from his own workstation, where he'd been analyzing market fluctuations in rare earth elements, and whistled appreciatively. 18%? That's going to save us a fortune in fuel costs, not to mention the competitive advantage of arriving ahead of other traders. It was simply a matter of applying Carillion probability matrices to Rigelian navigation algorithms, Serafina said, though her pleased expression suggested she was learning to take pride in her accomplishments. Different mathematical frameworks, but when you synthesize them properly, you get results that neither species would achieve independently, Marcus finished. Brilliant. No wonder your husband kept you locked away from anything intellectually challenging, you'd have made him look like an amateur. Serafina's smile faltered slightly at the mention of Kethran. "I received another message from him today. The 47th since we left Vermilion Prime. Still demanding you return to fulfill your wifely duties. Among other things. His creditors are apparently becoming quite insistent about collecting on his debts. It seems that losing the family fortune in a card game has consequences beyond social embarrassment." Marcus set down his data pad and gave her his full attention. "Are you having second thoughts? I know this situation isn't exactly conventional, and if you want to go back." "To what?" Serafina interrupted, her voice sharper than she'd intended. "To being treated like an ornamental trophy whose opinions are amusing but irrelevant. To watching my husband gamble away everything that matters while he dismisses my concerns as feminine hysteria." She took a deep breath, regaining her composure with the practiced ease of someone who'd spent years controlling her emotional responses in public. "I apologize. That was unbecoming." "That was honest," Marcus corrected gently. "And there's nothing unbecoming about honest anger at being treated badly. Your husband spent years taking you for granted, and now that he's lost you, he's finally realizing what he threw away. The communication system chimed with an incoming priority message, displaying the elaborate seal of House Vex in shimmering holographic detail. Serafina sighed and activated the display, revealing her husband's face with its familiar expression of aristocratic petulance mixed with barely controlled desperation. "Serafina," Kethran began without preamble, "this charade has gone on long enough. Your duty is to your family, not to some itinerant trader who has obviously filled your head with inappropriate ideas about your place in the natural order." "Hello, Kethran," Serafina replied evenly. "You're looking well. A bit thinner than usual, but stress does that to people. Do not attempt to deflect this with humor. The House of Vex is facing ruin because of your selfish abandonment of responsibility. My creditors are demanding immediate payment, and without the political connections your presence provided." "Without my presence providing what, exactly?" Serafina's voice carried a dangerous quiet that Marcus was learning to recognize as the precursor to controlled verbal devastation. "Without my smile at diplomatic functions to distract from your increasingly erratic behavior. Without my family's wealth to cover your gambling debts. Without my wife fulfilling her proper role instead of indulging in this fantasy of being some sort of mathematician-trader hybrid." Marcus watched the exchange with the fascination of someone observing a master class in marital dysfunction. Kethran's complete inability to understand why his wife had left was almost impressive in its obliviousness. "Fantasy?" Serafina's laugh held no warmth whatsoever. "Kethran, in the 3 weeks I've been gone, I've optimized hyperspace routes, negotiated trade agreements with 4 different species, and contributed to business decisions that have generated more profit than your family's estates produced in the last 5 years. What part of that strikes you as fantasy? You are not equipped for such work. Your education was designed to prepare you for noble marriage, not for commercial ventures. My education in xenomathematics, interstellar politics, and cultural analysis was supposed to prepare me to be a decorative conversation piece at dinner parties," Serafina corrected. "The fact that it also happens to be incredibly valuable in interstellar trade is just a happy coincidence." Kethran's image flickered slightly, suggesting the transmission was coming from somewhere with less than optimal communication infrastructure. "Your place is here, with your family. With your husband. This human has clearly manipulated you into believing. Mr. Chen has manipulated me into believing that my intelligence has value beyond entertainment purposes," Serafina interrupted. "He has manipulated me into thinking that my opinions matter in decisions that affect my own life. Truly diabolical manipulation." Marcus bit back a laugh at the carefully controlled sarcasm in her voice. Living with Serafina had been educational in many ways, not least of which was learning that Altarian noble ladies were apparently trained from birth in the fine art of polite verbal evisceration. "You mock me," Kethran said, his voice rising with wounded dignity. "You mock your own husband, your own family, your own heritage. I mock your assumption that any of those things give you the right to treat me like property," Serafina replied. "I mock your belief that genetic heritage excuses moral bankruptcy. And I particularly mock your sudden concern for my welfare now that your creditors are threatening to seize the family estates. If you return immediately, we can salvage the situation. I've arranged another game with Commodore Thane, higher stakes this time. With your dowry as collateral. You want to gamble my inheritance?" Serafina's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than shouting would have. "You want to risk the wealth my family brought to our marriage in another game of quantum nexus? It's the only way to recover our position. One decisive victory." "No." The word fell like a judgment. "Absolutely not. The marriage contract gave you administrative access to my family's wealth, not ownership. I hereby revoke that access and declare your gambling debts to be your personal responsibility rather than family obligations." Kethran's face went through several interesting color changes as the implications sank in. "You cannot simply, the law requires. The law requires spousal consent for major financial decisions involving inherited wealth," Serafina said with the tone of someone quoting legal text from memory. "Consent which I am hereby formally withdrawing." I believe the phrase is, due to irreconcilable differences regarding fiscal responsibility. Marcus raised his eyebrows at this unexpected development. You've been studying Eltarian marriage law? Among other things. It turns out that noble ladies are expected to understand the legal frameworks that govern their lives, even if they're not expected to use that understanding for anything more significant than managing household budgets. The transmission from Kethran cut off abruptly, leaving them in silence broken only by the gentle hum of the ship's systems. Serafina stared at the blank communication screen for a long moment, her expression unreadable. That felt remarkably satisfying, she said finally. I bet it did. Though you realize this means he's probably going to lose the family estates. The family estates that he's been systematically mortgaging to fund his gambling addiction for the past 5 years. Serafina's smile was sharp enough to cut hyperspace. The estates that he valued more than his wife's happiness or dignity. What a tragic loss. Marcus studied her carefully, noting the complex mix of emotions playing across her features. Are you sure you're okay with this? Watching your old life collapse isn't always as satisfying as it seems like it should be. Serafina was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the star field visible through the main viewport. When she spoke, her voice carried a note of wonder that suggested she was still discovering things about herself. Do you know what the strangest part is? I thought I would feel guilty about abandoning him when he needed help. I thought family loyalty would override my anger at being treated like property. She turned to face Marcus directly. Instead, I feel free. For the first time in years, I feel like I'm living my own life instead of playing a role in someone else's story. That's not strange at all. That's healthy. Is it? Because I was raised to believe that personal fulfillment was secondary to family duty and social stability. And how did that work out for your family's social stability? Serafina laughed, the sound genuine and unguarded in a way that would have been unthinkable in her former life. Point taken. Though I suspect Kethran would argue that the instability is entirely due to my selfish abandonment of traditional values. Kethran would probably argue that water flows uphill if it supported his worldview. The man wagered his wife in a card game and is now surprised that she doesn't want to be treated like property. The communication system chimed again, this time with a message from the Vermilion Prime Commercial Registry. Marcus accepted the transmission, revealing a Carillion bureaucrat whose tentacles were performing what passed for apologetic gestures among her species. Mr. Chen, we have received several complaints regarding your recent acquisition of Lady Serafina Vex. The complaints allege improper procedures in the transfer of noble marriage contracts and demand immediate investigation of potential fraud. Let me guess, Marcus said wearily. The complaints came from Lord Kethran Vex and his creditors. Among others. The Noble Affairs Tribunal has requested that Lady Serafina return to Vermilion Prime for questioning regarding the circumstances of her departure. Serafina moved into the transmission range, her posture shifting into the formal bearing she'd learned as a diplomatic wife. This is Lady Serafina. I am prepared to answer any questions the tribunal might have, but I will not return to Vermilion Prime unless guaranteed safe passage and protection from any attempts at coercion. The tribunal cannot guarantee protection from family intervention if you are found to have violated marriage contract obligations. Then the tribunal will have to conduct its investigation remotely. I am quite willing to submit to legal questioning, but I will not place myself within reach of people who have already demonstrated their willingness to treat me as negotiable property. The bureaucrat's tentacles writhed with bureaucratic frustration. This situation is highly irregular. Noble marriage contracts are not typically portable in this manner. Neither are noble husbands typically willing to wager their wives in games of chance, Serafina replied coolly. Perhaps the irregularity lies in the circumstances rather than in my response to them. After several more minutes of circular discussion, they managed to arrange for remote legal proceedings that would allow Serafina to address the tribunal's concerns without returning to her husband's jurisdiction. As the transmission ended, Marcus found himself impressed by her calm handling of bureaucratic pressure. You're getting good at this whole standing up for yourself thing, he observed. Practice makes perfect, I suppose. Though I have to admit, there's something liberating about not caring whether my responses are considered appropriately feminine. What do you mean? In my former life, every word I spoke in public was carefully calculated to avoid giving offense or appearing too opinionated. It was exhausting, trying to be intelligent enough to be interesting but not so intelligent as to be threatening. Marcus shook his head in disgust. What a waste. Do you know how rare it is to find someone who can think originally about complex problems? Your husband had a genuine intellectual partner and treated her like a decoration. Yes, well, his loss is your gain, as they say. Serafina returned to her navigation calculations, but Marcus could see the pleased flush coloring her pointed ears. Speaking of which, I've been thinking about our next trade route. If we combine Zephyrian energy crystals with Terran computational matrices, we could create hybrid systems that would be incredibly valuable to species working on quantum infrastructure projects. Now that, Marcus said with genuine enthusiasm, sounds like the kind of impossible thing that's going to make us both very rich. As they worked together on the complex calculations required for their next venture, both of them were aware that somewhere in the galaxy, Kethran was probably discovering just how expensive it could be to treat people like possessions rather than partners. The Galactic Commercial Arbitration Center on Nexus Prime was the sort of sterile, imposing structure designed to make everyone entering it feel appropriately humbled by the weight of interstellar law. Serafina stood before the tribunal's holographic assembly, her posture perfectly composed despite the magnitude of what she was about to do. Beside her, Marcus offered silent support, his presence a reminder that she was no longer facing her challenges alone. Lady Serafina Vex, intoned Arbiter Corvain, a Rigelian whose tentacles writhed with official authority, you stand accused of abandoning your legal matrimonial obligations and fraudulently transferring family assets. How do you respond to these charges? I respond by questioning the premise that a person can be owned through matrimonial contract, Serafina replied, her voice carrying the clear confidence of someone who'd spent months preparing for this moment. And by noting that the fraudulent transfer consisted of revoking consent for my husband to gamble away my inheritance while I was being wagered like property. The holographic images of the tribunal members flickered as they conferred in their various languages, the translation matrices struggling to keep up with the complex legal arguments being exchanged. At the far end of the chamber, Kethran sat with his legal representative, his silver features arranged in an expression of wounded dignity that might have been more convincing if he hadn't spent the preceding months desperately trying to reclaim the wife he'd never valued. The marriage contract in question was legally executed under Altarian noble law, argued Kethran's advocate, a thin-faced human who specialized in interstellar matrimonial disputes. Lady Serafina's abandonment of her obligations constitutes breach of contract and unjust enrichment at the expense of House Vex. Unjust enrichment? Serafina's laugh held no humor. I prevented my inheritance from being lost to gambling debts. That's not unjust enrichment, that's basic financial self-preservation. Arbiter Corvain's tentacles performed the equivalent of calling for order. The tribunal will hear testimony regarding the circumstances that led to Lady Serafina's departure from Vermilion Prime. Lord Vex, please state your account of events. Kethran rose with the careful dignity of someone whose world had collapsed but who refused to admit it. Honored arbiters, my wife was lawfully won in honorable gaming by one Marcus Chen, a human traitor. However, this Chen person has clearly manipulated her into believing she has legal standing to void our marriage contract and steal family assets. I didn't steal anything, Serafina interjected calmly. I prevented theft. There's a significant difference. You prevented your husband from managing family resources according to his legal authority, Kethran's advocate countered. I prevented my husband from gambling away everything I inherited from my family to cover debts he incurred without my consent or knowledge. Serafina activated a holographic display showing detailed financial records. Over the past 5 years, Lord Vex has systematically mortgaged family properties, borrowed against future earnings, and pledged assets he didn't own to fund an increasingly destructive gambling addiction. The financial data painted a picture of aristocratic decline that was both comprehensive and damning. Kethran's face went through several interesting color changes as his fiscal irresponsibility was laid bare before the tribunal. Furthermore, Serafina continued, the marriage contract that supposedly gives him authority over my assets specifically requires spousal consultation on major financial decisions. A requirement he has ignored consistently while treating me as decorative furniture whose opinions are irrelevant. Your wife's emotional state does not invalidate legal obligations, Kethran said desperately. She is clearly suffering from some form of psychological manipulation. The only psychological manipulation I suffered was being told for years that my intelligence was inappropriate for a noble wife and that my worth was determined by my ability to smile appropriately at dinner parties. Serafina's voice remained level, but Marcus could see the controlled fury in her violet eyes. Mr. Chen's manipulation consisted of treating me like a person whose thoughts and contributions have value. Arbiter Corvain gestured for silence with several tentacles simultaneously. The tribunal has reviewed the original gaming records from the Celestial Crown Casino. The wager was indeed legally witnessed and properly recorded. However, the question remains whether the marriage contract itself was validly transferred through such means. Altarian noble law explicitly permits the resolution of honor disputes through formal wagering, Kethran's advocate argued. The precedent dates back centuries. Altarian noble law also requires that both parties to a marriage consent to major changes in their legal status, countered the advocate Marcus had retained, a sharp-featured Carillion who specialized in matrimonial liberation cases. Lady Serafina was never asked for her consent to being wagered, nor was she informed that her marriage contract was being used as collateral. Wives do not consent to their husbands' honor disputes. They are bound by the outcomes as a matter of traditional law. Traditional law that violates current galactic personal autonomy accords, the Carillion replied smoothly. Which supersede local customs regarding the treatment of individuals as transferable property. The legal arguments continued for another hour, with various precedents cited and constitutional principles debated in the dry, technical language that made interstellar law simultaneously precise and incomprehensible. Through it all, Serafina maintained her composure, responding to questions with the careful precision of someone who'd spent months studying every relevant legal framework. Lady Serafina, Arbiter Corvain said finally, the tribunal must ask, if given the choice to return to your previous marriage with all obligations intact, or to remain in your current situation, what would your preference be? The question hung in the sterile air of the tribunal chamber like a challenge thrown down before destiny itself. Serafina looked at Kethran, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time, not as the powerful noble she'd married, but as a weak man whose arrogance had destroyed everything he'd claimed to value. Honored Arbiter, 6 months ago I would have said that duty and family obligation required me to return, regardless of personal preference. I was raised to believe that individual happiness was secondary to social stability and genetic continuity. She paused, her gaze shifting to Marcus before returning to the tribunal. I have since learned that a society which requires individuals to sacrifice their dignity and autonomy for the sake of stability is not worth preserving. That is not an answer to the question, Kethran's advocate protested. It is exactly an answer to the question, Serafina replied. Given the choice, I choose to remain with someone who values my intelligence, respects my autonomy, and treats me as a partner rather than property. I choose to live my own life rather than play a role in someone else's story. Even if that choice means abandoning centuries of family tradition and noble obligation. Especially if it means abandoning traditions that reduce people to bargaining chips in games of ego and pride. Kethran rose abruptly from his chair, his composure finally cracking completely. You think this human truly cares for you? You think his respect is genuine? He won you in a card game, Serafina. You are nothing more to him than a prize to be claimed. The accusation echoed through the chamber with all the desperate venom of someone whose worldview was collapsing in real time. Marcus started to respond, but Serafina raised a hand to stop him. Kethran, she said quietly, Marcus won a game you chose to play with stakes you chose to set. But unlike you, he immediately offered me a choice about my own future. Unlike you, he values my contributions to our partnership. Unlike you, he has never once treated me as property to be owned or displayed. He has manipulated you into betraying your own family. He has helped me discover that I have value beyond my bloodline and my ability to produce heirs for your house." Serafina's voice carried the quiet strength of someone who'd found her own worth after years of being told she had none. That is not manipulation. That is liberation. Kethran stared at his wife, his former wife, with the expression of someone watching his entire identity dissolve before his eyes. "I loved you," he said desperately. "Everything I did was to maintain our position, our honor." "You loved the idea of me," Serafina corrected gently. "You loved having a beautiful, accomplished wife who made you look successful and important. You never loved me as a person, because you never bothered to learn who I actually was beneath the role you wanted me to play." The silence that followed was broken only by the soft humming of the tribunal's recording equipment and the distant sound of interstellar traffic outside the chamber's reinforced windows. "The tribunal has reached its decision," Arbiter Corvain announced, his tentacles arranging themselves in the formal configuration required for legal pronouncements. While the original gaming wager was technically legal under Altarian noble law, the transfer of marriage contracts without spousal consent violates current galactic personal autonomy standards. Therefore, Lady Serafina's marriage to Lord Kethran Vex is hereby dissolved, and her right to control her inherited assets is confirmed. Kethran's legal representative immediately began filing appeals, but the outcome was clear to everyone present. Serafina was free, legally and finally, to choose her own path forward. As they left the tribunal chamber, Marcus found himself walking beside someone who'd been transformed by the legal proceedings. The uncertain woman who'd been wagered in a card game had been replaced by someone who knew her own worth and was prepared to defend it. "So," he said as they made their way through the station's crowded corridors, "how does it feel to be officially divorced and financially independent?" "Terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure," Serafina replied. "Though I have to admit, the look on Kethran's face when the tribunal confirmed my asset control was worth every minute of legal anxiety." "Any regrets?" Serafina considered the question as they waited for transport back to their ship. "I regret that it took me so long to realize I deserved better. I regret the years I wasted trying to be someone else's idea of perfect. But leaving? Choosing my own life over his expectations?" She smiled with genuine happiness. "No regrets about that at all." "Good, because I have a proposition for you." "Another one?" "The last time you made a proposition, I ended up divorced and running a trading business. This proposition is a bit more personal." Marcus stopped walking and turned to face her directly. "We've been partners for 6 months now, business partners and friends. But I'd like to know if you'd be interested in exploring whether we could be something more." Serafina blinked in surprise, not because the possibility hadn't occurred to her, but because she'd never expected anyone to ask for her consent before making assumptions about their relationship. "You're asking for my permission to court me?" "I'm asking if you'd like to find out what it feels like to be in a relationship built on mutual respect and genuine affection instead of genetic compatibility and social obligation." "That sounds..." Serafina paused, considering her words carefully. "That sounds like the most wonderful thing anyone has ever offered me." As they boarded the transport that would take them back to their ship and their life together, both of them were aware that somewhere behind them, Kethran was probably still trying to understand how treating someone as property had cost him the only thing that had ever truly mattered. 6 months later, as their trading partnership continued to flourish and their personal relationship deepened into something built on equality and mutual respect, they received one final message from Kethran. He'd lost the family estates, been disowned by his relatives, and was working as a junior clerk in a commercial shipping office, a spectacular fall from noble grace that was already becoming a cautionary tale told in gambling halls across the galaxy. "Do you ever wonder if we should try to help him?" Marcus asked after deleting the message. "I wonder if he's finally learned that people aren't possessions to be wagered," Serafina replied. "And I hope that someday he finds someone who can teach him what love actually means." "What does love actually mean?" Serafina smiled, the expression radiant with the confidence of someone who discovered her own worth and found a partner who celebrated it. Love means treating someone as your equal, valuing their thoughts and dreams, and choosing to build something together rather than trying to own each other. That sounds like a pretty good definition, Marcus agreed, pulling her closer as their ship carried them toward their next adventure. Though I still can't believe your husband was stupid enough to gamble away the best thing that ever happened to him. His loss, Serafina said simply. My gain. And in the vast expanse of space around them, filled with infinite possibilities and uncharted territories, two people who'd found each other through the most unlikely circumstances continued their journey together, proving that sometimes the best things in life come from refusing to accept that love should be anything less than freely given and joyfully received.